That's the reason I'm not personally upset with Uber or eBay or any of them or Kickstarter or Indiegogo. They're taking their fees. And I don't think regulation can fix this. I think the reason they can't do that is because no one's developed the technology to move away from that. But if we show that it's possible to build this technology, if we show how this is done, I think we're going to see the next 10 years, crypto might find its niche in just like, that's, I think, the future. Large intermediaries that are no longer needed.
Welcome to episode 6 of Unlayered, talking about one of the more exciting projects I've ever seen in all of crypto. But before we get into that, a lot happening this past week, specifically on the regulatory side. A lot of doom and gloom. It seems like Operation Choke Point is in full swing. Dave, what are your thoughts on what's happening these days?
I mean, it's just been bombshell after bombshell for about we're recording this on Tuesday, the 6th, and the last 24 hours have just been crazy. So both Binance and Coinbase are being sued by the SEC, but also included within that, funnily enough, was a list of projects, including Solana. So Solana, Cardano, Matic, Atom, and various others, which were included as securities, just snuck into the Binance suing papers. So I think that was interesting. And the reasons, I just had a quick read before recording this about why Solana specifically has been selected. And very strange. One of them was that apparently Anatoly has been trying to pump the price. And the quote they give is that in a Medium blog, he stated that Solana supports upwards of 50,000 transactions per second, making it the most performant blockchain and the world's first web-scale decentralized network. And that's one of their reasons that it is performant and better than the competition. Apparently that makes it a security. So it does seem very strange. The other thing that they mentioned was the burn mechanism, because 50% of fees on Solana are burnt. But of course, that is a pretty negligible amount. And especially when you consider that Ethereum has not been cited, and yet Ethereum is very much deflationary. And in fact, I think they contribute around 80% of their income towards burning Ethereum, the token. So just wondering what are your takes?
I think one of the funniest quotes actually was just out of like the whole bunch of them throughout the paperwork, when I guess Binance's CCO or something like that admitted, we are operating as an unlicensed securities exchange in the USA, bro. Like, this is a quote, I think, from 2018. It's not the best thing to be said. I think there was a lot of interesting new things I'm discovering throughout this process about how Binance US specifically was operated. So that's kind of what I've been focusing on, just because Binance is, massive exchange. It's where most trading volume occurs. And with respect to the US, the way I see it is, as a builder trying to build crypto products here, it's a bit disheartening to see this constant onslaught. It seems like every single day there's a new thing out, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, that is bearish crypto or makes operating a crypto company that much harder. So I just try to not overreact and not over-index to that. I don't think the industry is screwed. It's a harder time from a regulatory standpoint, but just trying to see the long term here. I still think the US is a fantastic market to operate in, and I'm hopeful that this is the worst of it, because it doesn't, I don't know, I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. It just seems like this punishment of crypto.
Yeah, exactly. They always talk about come in, talk to us, and that the regulations are clear. And that's just obviously not the case. I mean, I think Coinbase have tried to be the most compliant exchange out there, basically. I mean, they've even got accepted for an IPO. SEC is supposed to protect investors' funds, allow them to IPO, and now suddenly I think their share price is down 20% because the SEC deems their business model to be illegal. So, yeah, it's hard to justify that that's a warm and welcoming handshake from the SEC.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to watch how this all develops. But I guess pivoting in a more positive direction, and to that point earlier about this longer term vision of crypto, we're talking with the founder of Teleport today. And this is one example of what I hope to be many other examples of crypto projects kind of taking existing business models and industries and truly creating a way to decentralize it and turn a business into a protocol. In this specific case, Teleport is addressing the rideshare market. But I think this is kind of why a lot of us got in the industry and why a lot of us got excited, especially, dating back to the ICO days where these projects had these grand visions of, decentralizing X, Y, and Z. Well, here's a real working example.
Yeah, and not to spoil anything for the listeners, but this was genuinely one of the most inspirational talks I've ever had in crypto. So, amazing episode.
So today we're talking with Paul Bohm. Paul is the founder and CEO of Teleport.xyz. He was a very early employee at Dropbox and designed and built their peer-to-peer protocol that's now in use in millions of machines. He's been involved in crypto since 2011. And more recently, obviously, he's been part of like the broader Solana ecosystem with Teleport, which falls under the umbrella of the Decentralized Engineering Corporation, working on some very cool stuff and super, super insightful, and to David's point, inspirational conversation today. Welcome to episode 6 of Unlayered. We are joined here today by Paul Bohm, founder and CEO of Teleport. Paul, how's it going, man? It's been, I think I saw you last 2 years ago at Breakpoint. It feels like ancient history. How's everything been?
It's been a wild roller coaster, as you can imagine, but no, it's been fantastic. I recently got a message from the first domain I bought. Ideas become real when you buy a domain for it.
Everybody has 60 of them in their Google domains or whatever.
Exactly. All the projects you didn't work on. Well, this one I'm working on, and it's like a little over 2 years since I started working on this project. So really pumped to be here and good to see you again.
Yes, likewise. I remember, it's funny, at the time, this is a 2021 Breakpoint, and it was funny because they had this mansion that everyone kept renting for this for parties. We were there one night. I think I ran into you and a bunch of other people, and then Galaxy had theirs, and it ended up being at the same exact place. It's just the same group of people, and I think they really cleaned it up next year, and they went more low key with the venues. But it was certainly a relic of the bull market.
Yeah, it was nice though. I really liked, I think a lot of people. So this was Solana Breakpoint in Portugal, in Lisbon, in 2021. And, I think some people had issues with it being such a spread out location, right? I actually kind of liked it. I was like, this is actually kind of cool. I mean, it's really hard to pull off. And I definitely wasn't at all the events, but I feel like every location I went to, including, the crazy botanical garden stage.
Oh, that was amazing.
Right? It was like everything was actually quite busy. So the conference really impressed me back then. And yeah, so back then, I think Teleport was more of a crazy idea where I was this is possible now. I was not sure, I was more like, we're doing a prototype. We're going to spend a couple of months on making a prototype, show people this is possible. Mm-hmm. And just, the reception, especially I think with a spread out conference like that, where, Uber and all the local ride sharing didn't really work too well. People were just like, when can I teleport? I don't want to wait for my Uber. When can I teleport? And I was like, crazy. It's not only technically possible, but people really want it.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you come up with the name, by the way? It's a very good name. That was the first thing that struck me. I mean, I immediately thought of the Pokemon move, actually, teleport, just jumping between cities and stuff. How did that dawn on you?
Honestly, it was just thinking about transportation and thinking about what do we really want to do? What's important? What are the values that matter to people when you're trying to get around? And I feel like transportation on some level is a little bit of a commodity. I think this is a good thing when you're thinking about network effects on some level, but because you don't really want crazy differentiation. You want a nice car, a friendly driver, but really you want to get from A to B at a good price as fast as possible, right? Like the destination is usually the goal. Maybe it's nice if you can listen to music and it's banging, but for the most part, honestly, the ride is just thing in the middle. So I was like, what's the best mode of transportation anyone's ever invented? And I think, I don't know if he invented it, but I think Gene Roddenberry takes the cake with teleportation, right?
I was just wondering, do you consider it a deep-in project in the same vein as Helium and HiveMapper and things like that? Or do you consider it a separate category, more like a disintermediating centralized companies?
Well, I'll give a little bit of a background and maybe a little bit of an introduction of what I think Teleport is and how it fits in. So Teleport is a ride-sharing company, but it's not exactly what we're building. It's just the brand that consumers will see. What we're really building is the rideshare protocol Trip. And really a lot of the theory behind this came from thinking about protocols for a really long time. Like, I worked on, used to work in computer security. I dealt with a lot of protocols from all the way back in the 90s. Then I was at Dropbox early on, and I wrote their peer-to-peer protocol. It's called the Dropbox LAN Sync protocol. And I'm actually really proud of it. I wrote the core of it in just 2 months right after joining. It's running, I don't know on how many, but like tens, hundreds of millions of machines. And never, to my knowledge, had a security issue. So been really proud of that. And I was thinking about protocols for a long time. But what I kind of noticed was there's really open protocols on the internet, like email, like the web, and they're really protocol suites, right? You have the simple mail transfer protocol, you have the POP, IMAP, like all of these different things. But I think it's actually reasonable to just call it the email protocol, the web protocol suite, the internet protocol suite, and all of them are very, very open. Then there's these really closed protocols like ride sharing, right? Lyft has a protocol clearly where the Lyft mobile app on the phone for the driver and the rider, they talk with the Lyft server, but they don't talk with each other, and they definitely don't talk with Uber. Like maybe Lyft would like that, Uber doesn't want to. So you really have these local fortresses. And so I think where we started was kind of like, maybe it's possible now to create something that's better and open. But then you still have the problem, right? You have a fortress, and a fortress has a moat, and that moat is generally considered to be the network effect. And so what I started long before starting to designing the Trip protocol and starting to work on Teleport, I thought about what does it take to build a bridge? Because everyone's been talking for as long as I've been in internet technology, which is, as I said, the 90s. Everyone's been talking about network effects and moats, and then there's been really good books written about this from like the Clayton Christensen, the Innovator's Dilemma, then Crossing the Chasm, all the way to the Cold Start Problem by Andrew Chen, who actually was at Uber and also at Dropbox, and like a bunch of big other companies that did really well. And I think we got some good research into how to build these network effects, but I think very few people have thought about how do you actually build bridges? Like, how do you break these network effects? Because I think you have this phase one, the internet is empty. It's a frontier. It's the internet frontier, and we built the internet economy. But then you get to stage two, which is, okay, most of the territory has already been seized, but it doesn't mean that these companies that have seized it are actually competent or good for the ecosystem. I mean, eBay is a $22 billion company. Uber takes 44% of every ride. Like eBay looks like it's stuck in the 90s. You can say that like maybe, Craigslist is better, but I think to some degree, just because it doesn't squeeze the users as much, is it really better because it doesn't provide a good user experience? And so where I'm getting at with this is like, how do you break this network effects? I think is what we're going to see in the next 10 years. So where I see it is primarily not as it's a deep in company for sure. It's a physical infrastructure network. But what I think it's more concretely, because it's a little bit different from these projects, I guess they're trying to compete with GSM. They're trying to compete with different things. But for me, it's primarily an exercise in how to build protocols that are self-sustaining, truly independent, and able to replace intermediaries that are really just sitting in the middle. They really don't do much of anything, right? Like Uber is basically, I don't know, it feels a little bit like me. I don't want to, like compare too much with SpaceX here, but it feels a little bit like Elon sitting down and being like, why are rockets so expensive? And I think you can sit down with Uber and you get all these excuses like, well, the manufacturers of these screws, they're just expensive. And it's like, well, the metal doesn't cost that much. And so this is the question I've been asking myself with Uber. So I see it as a deep in project, but I think more than anything, it's an attempt to break network effects.
Zooming out a bit, because you've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about protocols. You've been early in the internet, early work at Dropbox, early in crypto too, which is important. But how did you decide specifically? Because there's a lot of things that this applies to. A lot of rent extractors, and you brought up a few of them. eBay is one of them. Uber, obviously. But how did you decide on rideshare specifically as like, this is the wedge I want to dive into to potentially disintermediate the monopolies or duopolies that exist here?
That's a fantastic question. It's exactly the right question. Like, I did not say it has to be ride sharing. That definitely was not the starting point. The starting point was how do you actually quantify how strong a network effect is? So there's a bunch of different categories you can apply to this, and you're going to find this in our light paper, which we're going to start circulating in probably a couple of weeks. But it's on the level of like, drivers in ride sharing they might have their own unique approach to how they're doing their job, but from the perspective of the consumer, it still comes down to price, maybe a category of car quality, how cheap it is and how fast it is. So it's kind of a little bit more fungible than, let's say, like a vacation rental, right? There's a really unique vacation rental somewhere in the desert that is fantastic and is very different from a little hut that's just 20 meters over. Similarly, in a place in Manhattan is different from a place in Brooklyn. So like there's massive difference. Also, the market is actually, so it's fungible. Then the market is really global, meaning ride sharing has definitely travelers that are very important, and airports are a very important point in the ecosystem. But at the same time, most of your bread and butter is still going to be the local traffic. So it's a little bit less global, a lot of bookings, people searching even in a different country. So the network effect is stronger there, let's say on vacation rentals. There's also a different saturation point. If you have only 10% of the listings in a local market and you compete against someone who has like 10x more listings, that makes a huge difference. In ride sharing, if you have 50 drivers, even if Uber or Lyft have, let's say, 500 or 1,000 drivers in the same market, as long as the driver shows up in 3 to 5 minutes, which if you have a driver per square mile is given, so the saturation point is very different. And also it's a lot easier to multi-home for a driver, or actually in food delivery for a restaurant, it's even easier to multi-home than for a vacation rental, because your calendar, managing that between multiple places. Also, like there's not really the same like legal restrictions that to my knowledge, I'm not a lawyer, but to my knowledge, like in vacation rental, there's not as much legal restrictions that force Airbnb to make it easy for you to allow the drivers to multi-home. While in ride sharing, since they're independent contractors, it's my understanding they can actually multi-home and just have multiple apps open and no one can really stop them. So there was really a lot of factors. And then I think most importantly, it's just kind of insane. I think the take rate is too high. Both how much you pay as a consumer, but even more so, I've heard and I've seen it myself, people take a 3-hour ride in an Uber and the driver still has to drive back, might be $160, but the driver gets like, what, $60? And I'm like, where's that money going? And then you kind of think about it. Uber has 30,000 employees, $10 billion in debt, giant buildings. And it's just in general, like you kind of know where it goes. And so like I went through a list and I kind of realized, I think this narrative that ride sharing has such a strong network effect, I think that might just be a mirage. I think it's actually much weaker than people think. And I don't think another company can pull it off, because the drivers they don't trust anyone anymore. And I think they're right to not trust anyone, to be honest. But I think a protocol where not expecting every driver to deeply understand crypto, but if you think about it, it's kind of like with Bitcoin in the early days. There's people who really get it that are trusted by other people that act as translators. So if you make something that's truly, truly trusted, meaning you don't actually control the thing, it might take a little bit for people to understand that you really don't control the thing. Satoshi does not control Bitcoin, right? And that took a while for people to really get the implications of that. And I don't think it will be overnight for people to get this. But if you build it with that goal and the experts can look at it and say, no, they don't control this, I think it will kind of reach the average drivers and they will realize, man, this is actually a better deal because they can't just rescind this. They don't have the power to rescind it. It's truly, truly an open protocol.
The only thing with open protocols is obviously you can have companies come in and offer a centralized service on top of it. So it's a bit like what's happened with email, Gmail and Hotmail and all those, use that and then provide a service. So what stops centralized companies coming in and building on top of your protocol and still taking a take rate and just sort of throwing money at the problem to try and do away with a decentralized version?
Yeah, we thought a lot about that. And I think there's always an incentive to centralize in pretty much in anything you do. And you got to actively fight that for it to not seep in. I do think the core here really is voice and exit. So like if you don't have exit, you have a problem. So we need to make it easy for people to start. In ride sharing, there's something called a TNC. That's a transportation network company. That's a legal term that was basically created after Uber expanded into the space. Probably has a ton of legal implications. We have fantastic lawyers, that actually wrote a bunch of these laws on the rideshare side. But I'm not a lawyer, so take that with a grain of salt. I just have really good advisors. But basically, the way we see it is these TNCs. You can just apply for a license to get a TNC in a lot of states in the US. And it's easier than you think. It might, you need to comply with the rules, you need insurance, you need to deal with all of the rules and regulations that are there for safety and for making, sure, that you're not harming anyone, that the traffic is good. But in theory, the two of you or like anyone who's listening to this can get a TNC license. Like there's an application process and it often costs less than $1,000. In many, many states, it costs more in others. And the problem you then have is, well, you don't have the software, like the industrial grade software, to actually handle both the ride sharing side, the server side, the routing, the mapping, and you don't have the mobile app that's of a high quality. And I think an individual or, like a small entrepreneur would not be able to afford that. We're planning to open source everything we do. So that's going to make it a lot easier. But then you still have this problem. You don't actually have drivers and riders. And that means your utilization is low. This is bad for the drivers. And your wait time is bad, which is bad for the passengers. And what we're doing is we're just making it so that anyone can start a TNC, a transportation network company, has the software and tools to operate that company. This can even, be a software as a service, kind of like WordPress.com is open source, but they operate it for you and they give you all the tools you need to run your blog. We can do the same thing, or also others can do it, right? This WP engine, like make it easy to run that server. But then on the other side, there's also web browsers. And there's far less web browsers than there are, different websites out there. So what I expect is going to happen some level of concentration. Similarly, as we're seeing already in crypto wallets, people will trust a few, like maybe top 3, top 4 wallets, and will be a little bit more skeptical about the rest. But you still have exit. You can fork the code. So we're probably going to do something like Teleportium, which is like Chromium being the open source version of Chrome. Teleportium is going to be the open source version of Teleport. We intend to initially really run Teleport, which is kind of like a web browser. It doesn't do ride sharing. It's just a client for the rideshare companies. We're planning to run that like a business. And we're also intending to, open a few operating companies more as a proof of concept. but we don't actually know if we want to keep or hold on to that portion of the business. We don't see ourselves as a ride-sharing business at all. Like, we can see spinning these out over time. We don't have a concrete plan, but that's not our goal. We are protocol builders. So the moment this protocol runs, it should be open source, and we want to contribute like as just yet another contributor. And also, we want to actually look forward. The moment this thing is actually being developed on by a thriving ecosystem, for us, it's actually the question, what's the next protocol we should be building?
I guess kind of a follow-up on that point, because I see this longer-term vision where lots of independent operators are building on this protocol, or maybe not lots, but some of them are doing this and having a ton of passengers. But can you help us understand kind of bridging that gap between today, where the protocol is not necessarily out yet? Like, do you guys see yourselves potentially being one of the first kind of experiments? Like, even Google has Chrome, even though they open sourced Chromium. And kind of how do you mentioned it before, start bringing on those initial passengers and drivers? Because I see it's a clear value prop for both. It's cheaper for the passengers and drivers make more money. That's great. But maybe help us understand that initial process.
Absolutely. So we are actually quite close. I can't give you like a concrete timeline, but definitely next couple months this year.
Ooh.
Super exciting to basically get the permits to operate, insurance, all of the different parts that we need, background checks, motor vehicle records. There's a lot that we need to do. So like this protocol involves identity, background checks. It's took a bit to design all of this, because we are very careful with things like privacy. So everything that's private is not actually stored on chain as much as possible. So the only thing that needs to be on chain is on chain. And we have plans to even further increase the privacy there down the road. So we're giving everyone who gets, like their identity or phone number verified a certificate into their app. So they have full control. It's not stored anywhere else. It's okay. You can identify to anyone, hey, I've been background checked, or if the protocol needs it, or for legal reasons, you can also say, my ID has been verified and my name is, or my ID has been verified and my birth date is this, or you keep it private and you're just saying you're proving this. We're in the version 1 intentionally not doing this with zero knowledge proofs. We have ideas of how to expand that, but I think it's just easier to reason about the way we do it with very simple certificates. So all of this is really in progress. So we're getting these licenses, we turn it on. Now we're legally permitted to operate a ride-sharing company as a separate entity and a mobile app in the App Store that is a full wallet that you can actually use to order a car with. All the drivers are background checked. The passengers have a verified phone number. So like basically everything exactly the same as on Uber or Lyft or Bolt on any of these platforms. The UX very similar. We're native iOS apps, so just very smooth, very beautiful, very easy to use. We can accept credit cards. Essentially, we're acting, similar to like Booking.com in that role, like meaning we are helping you get a ride. And so like it's really different payment flows for whether you use your wallet or whether you're using us to just help you as a booking agent or an aggregator. Once we are permitted to do this, we're going to start rolling out in a few states in the US. At that point, it's already running on our backend, which is currently based on Solana. So like we're using USDC for all the payments. We allow people to use credit cards. Drivers can actually withdraw after they've been background checked. Everything is we know so much about them because we have to for these legal regulations. It's very easy to work with a partner who can then allow them to withdraw to a bank account. And at that point, we still don't have any users, no drivers, no riders. We're just allowed to go. I think there might be some people, we're going for some larger US states, I can't say where yet, who might just want to try it. But again, we're going to have a supply and demand imbalance at that point, right? Like imbalance being we don't have enough drivers, we don't have enough riders, both of them. But even if we get enough, let's say people who want to try it, we don't have enough drivers. So this is where a future stage comes in of the protocol, which is essentially this network effect bridge that we are very proud of. It's a coordination layer. It's my belief that decentralized marketplaces couldn't have been built before the intervention of digital money, because you need some kind of coordination mechanism to deal with supply and demand. Email, until now, hasn't needed digital money. I think that might change because of AI, because so much spam is going to start hitting, AI-generated spam is going to start hitting the network, that we're probably going to reinvent the post stamp, right? Which is ironically where Bitcoin has its origins too, with Hashcash. Which was a proof of work essentially to secure email from spam. So it's funny how it comes full circle. I think AI is actually pushing crypto is pushing AI. These things go very much hand in hand, more so than people think. We're always jumping on one hype train and think we can abandon the other, but it really, like, technology just goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like we have this balancing mechanism on the network, and it's basically a way of, imagine you're standing on a hill. This is where the Uber drivers are right now, the Lyft drivers, the Bolt drivers. And they're kind of like, this is like really just like a tiny little hill. This is not the optimum for us. And you see this mountain away where it's like, we could, if Uber didn't take all of this, we would be better off. Or the passengers are like, sometimes you can't get a ride, whether that's Halloween or New Year's, or you're just like, like at your parents' house and yet no one picks you up. Just like, there must be a better solution. Well, you can envision that mountain far away, but the problem is there's this valley you have to go through to get from your local hill to this mountain that's far away.
Yeah.
And there's just no way through. There's no one there. So what we came up with, it's similar to the analogy of the moat, if you think about it, right? There's this moat that Uber and Lyft have. And we see it as a bridge. We call that the balancing mechanism. So the balancing mechanism is balancing supply and demand. Just like you have drivers and riders on the network, you have balancers, and they invite drivers and riders and other entities like what we call verifiers. They provide, background checks, phone number verification as a service. And so as you're bringing supply of something that the marketplace is lacking, you actually get governance rights in the network. This goes back to what you said earlier, Dave. Like, how do we make sure that this doesn't centralize? Well, we are constantly giving the majority of the governance rights that are created through inflation on the network, new issuance. We're constantly giving this to drivers, riders, and people who bring supply of drivers, riders, verifiers. It's kind of like the role of a Bitcoin miner is to provide security to the network. The role of a balancer is to bring supply and demand to a marketplace.
Yeah, definitely want to understand more about that, because certainly one of the complaints that a lot of people have about these centralized entities like Uber and like Airbnb and like Wait is that they've reached their position off the backs of the people contributing to the network. And those people who have contributed to the network haven't actually received any sort of a stake, if you like, in its future. So is that how you see this governance token basically helping to incentivize people, and especially in the early days? And then also I'd just like to understand is like, will it be burned, or will there be a reduction in supply issuance? How are you thinking about that as the network grows?
So primarily we see it as a coordination, like as a tool for coordination and as a tool for governance. So like the entities that actually create, meaning I think it's important that everyone gets paid in US dollars for the core service they provide. So a driver gets paid for that. We're still working out on some details of how the verifiers get paid for their service. But again, like if you have basically some mechanism by which you issue certificates to the clients, you should be paid for that. So like the base of everything should just be US dollars or euros or wherever you are in your local market. We're primarily and only focusing on the US right now, but you can see how this would directly translate to the euro and many other places with a little bit extra thought on the payments or maybe translation between them. We're not at that stage. It's all US dollars, USDC. But I think governance is really important to just keep things fair. And so we got to think and we're having like a simulation. So we're doing agent-based modeling in like a scientific computing language called Julia, where we're simulating like a whole rideshare model. So we can very quickly create a map of any city in the world. We download it from OpenStreetMap, and then we put, drivers and riders based on, some assumptions around, traffic patterns. People drive to the office in the morning, and then they go back to their homes, to the more residential areas. We're simulating that little world, and then we're simulating the impact of various, payment systems. Like, let's say Uber is paying $25 if you invite someone, or, like something like that. And we're basically looking at what is necessary for this market to operate, and then what does it take to incentivize people to switch over. And it's very important for someone to switch over. They need to be able to get a better deal on our platform. So our solution to that is to say, pay more in dollars, just have a much, much lower take rate, plus give people governance rights. And obviously, if you switch early, you're going to get more. And if you invite more people, you bring more supply and demand early, which is much more valuable. You're getting more governance rights. You're really invested in making this ecosystem succeed. It's kind of irrational early on to go into something like this. A lot of people are going to tell you this is never going to work. But if you're crazy enough to jump in, well, it starts working, and then other people join in, and so that's the whole mechanism. Whether there is a burn and and all of that, I think that's really up to the voting of the people who have those governance rights. We think the contract needs to actually take a certain percentage. We don't know the exact number, again, that can be voted on. Like, we can just say maybe 10% of the right needs to go to the contract. And the reason for that is simply, if you don't do that, you're going to get killed by Sybil attacks, meaning people are just going to create fake rides between fake drivers and fake riders, even with all the background checks, and the governance rights don't go to real people. So these 10%, they can initially just go into a governance-controlled treasury by the contract. But down the road, yes, it would absolutely be possible to put to a vote whether, if secondary markets or something like that emerge. Again, we don't have any plans to. The tokens has governance purpose. We're not going to list it. We don't sell it to anyone. The only way to get the token is to work on the network, right? And so since it serves that purpose of constantly going to the people who either, grow the size of the network, which is real work, or drive or ride. And I think that's actually the most important activity of all of them. Like, if you actually use the network, that's important. That's the only mechanism you really get it. But if there is a secondary, it's not out of the question that someone, could put it to a vote that instead of putting it into the treasury of the contract, it could be burned. So there's a real possibility that this token could also have, various deflationary dynamics over time. But that's not for version 1. This thing is upgradable through governance. And so it will be really interesting to see where the community takes it once we reach that decentralization milestone, which for us is having multiple operating companies, having multiple verifiers, potentially even having multiple clients. From our perspective, we don't need immediately like another client. But I think for us, that point is reached even, like if the protocol is open and down the road when we're ready for it, the client is open source and people can run their own client.
Something I just thought about as I'm kind of listening to you speak about this is, and I agree with this notion that ride sharing seems like a great kind of entry point to bring crypto to a lot of people. For one, just because, to your point earlier, it's not necessarily something that benefits from strong network effects across the world. I think the simplest kind of test of this is if you go to Thailand, they use Grab. And Uber tried and failed to break into the Chinese market. For some reason, it's almost like each individual place where you have rideshare has its own characteristics and opportunity for other players to come in. So kind of on that, starting with that, how did you guys decide to do the US market specifically for your go-to-market? And are there any traits for these early places that you want to test in? Like, are people, for instance, more amenable to trying a new rideshare service, or is there some sort of other kind of thing you're looking for as you do this initial distribution?
I'm originally from Austria, and I've had my experience working on tech startups in Europe. And I think that's representative from the experience of a lot of places in the world. I think the US is still the best place in the world to build consumer products. And from the perspective of the users, we have a beautiful iOS app. This is not something for crypto people alone, like meaning you can use a credit card, you can withdraw to the bank account, you get a full wallet. So if Solana Pay and so on, gets more adoption, you have it there, you can instantly spend it. Like literally it's in your non-custodial wallet. So that's the one side. The other side is there's really no good argument against the US. Like meaning there's the regulation that exists now. The regulation is pretty, kind of straightforward to comply with, meaning we are literally like we have fantastic lawyers for crypto, we have fantastic general counsel, we have fantastic rideshare counsel, we got the advice we need, we have experts in ride sharing, who are our investors. Ryan McKillen, who built Uber, he was the third employee there and the first engineer, is one of our earliest investors. And many more people. Josh Mora, who built New York for Uber. We've got a lawyer who was literally a taxi and limousine commissioner in one of the states. So, we know what the rules are. And what we talked with regulators, and they actually love the idea because, think about it from the perspective of a regulator. Like if you have the intention of just making sure this is safe, and that your constituents, which are drivers, which are riders, are doing well, or if you think further, restaurant owners and so on, that they're not getting fleeced, but actually those are all, a lot of them are immigrants, minorities, they're small business owners. If you want them to do well, you kind of want an ecosystem where you don't have to negotiate with a single 80% plus almost monopolist. You actually like the idea that you're dealing with local companies that are fully regulated. If they violate some rules, then you can actually directly, instead of like 7 layers of insulation, you directly talk with the CEO of the transportation network company. Meaning it's not like this is a protocol and we are out of the reach of the law or anything like that. Quite the opposite, where every ride is fully regulated, in full compliance, has full insurance, full customer support, full cooperation with the police if that's necessary, right? So this is not the Wild West. And I think that's actually a little bit, it's unusual for crypto, for someone to dig this deep into the regulation. But like every part of what we do is both letter and spirit of the law, meaning, we're not fintech, we're not quite crypto. I see us as regtech. Like we're regulatory technology in the sense that we're actually doing something that regulators love us to do, which is opening this market up to many, many small competitors. There's really nothing wrong with that as long as they're in full compliance, they're audited, they have the background checks. And a lot of what we had to do to get here was figure out how to do that.
I thought you actually said a wreck tech, as in like we're going to wreck the competition. So glad you clarified.
That might happen, but we're creating a lot of competition, right? So it's kind of like it's like a Kodak moment or something, I think, where we don't really have I know a lot of people have a lot of issues with Uber. I think Uber actually did something pretty cool when they started. I think it's my analogy for these companies, whether it be Twitter or Uber, for any of these monopolies is the One Ring in Lord of the Rings, right? It's not that Gandalf would be better for holding the ring than Frodo. The ring is just too powerful. Like you can't give it to anyone. So what do? You throw it back, into the volcano in which it was forged, which is the internet, and you turn it into a protocol. So I think the future, if we are right, and I think we are right, if we demonstrate this with Uber, we're going to see what I call protocol tokens. So you asked me deep in. What I really see is protocol tokens or protocols that use incentive alignment for all of these things that right now need to be done by companies. That's the reason I'm not personally upset with Uber or eBay or any of them, or Kickstarter or Indiegogo, they're taking their fees. And I don't think regulation can fix this. I think the reason they can't do that is because no one's developed the technology to move away from that. But if we show that it's possible to build this technology, if we show how this is done, I think we're going to see the next 10 years, crypto might find its niche in just like taking down large intermediaries that are no longer needed. That's, I think, the future.
I feel like there's not enough crypto projects that are kind of taking this approach where the crypto side is, I don't want to say invisible, but it's really just about like a core product that people already use. It's a commodity. And like, I'm no different. The way I use Uber and Lyft today is I just open both up, and whichever one's cheaper, I use it. And it just gets you from point A to point B. So obviously, this could help a lot of people if it's cheaper and if it's better for the drivers. I guess one question I had, because you brought up earlier this notion of like the non-custodial wallet that people can use and the potential to use USDC for payments instead of a credit card. How do you think about, given that this is a more general market that might not be crypto native at all, what are they going to think of opening this thing that's a wallet? Do they know it's a wallet? Would you nudge them to use USDC? Would it be cheaper for them? How do you think of this type of stuff for them?
I think initially I expect most people to just use a credit card. And the drivers are getting USDC, but I expect a lot of them just to want to use a debit card to access their funds instantly, or to use the ACH withdrawal, which takes a little bit longer. And we're going to try to match, what's the industry standard on both of those things. And we have fantastic partners, multiple ones we're talking to right now, and everyone's really, really excited. So that's actually the thing that's been I'm not going to say surprising, but it's really fantastic, actually. Like every partner we talk to, everyone really gets what we're trying to do, and everyone's really excited to work with us. I think we can match pretty much everything the competition does. We're more focused. But I think down the road, people are going to see additional features that are only possible if you go towards USDC. And let's say if, down the road, food delivery became a thing that I think is possible to build on top of the Rideshare protocol, like as kind of like either a protocol extension or a separate protocol. We haven't really, completely designed this. We're very focused on what we're doing right now. But then you could actually, drive a little bit, and then you actually, use the app to order like a pickup and get, like your food while you're a driver. And people kind of could start getting into this habit of using it instantly. I think on the other side, there's certain applications, if you have USDC, which behaves different in that it behaves, more like a coin that is non-reversible. Like you could, for example, for New Year's or for Halloween, you could imagine that you can bid a lot more money and saying, hey, I really need to get to the airport. I know it's Halloween, but I still need to get to the airport. Please pick me up. I'm willing to pay more, which you can't do as easily with credit cards because you're just afraid of the chargebacks. Today or yesterday, I read a Twitter thread about someone who was like, saying, hey, Stripe shut us down. No offense to Stripe here. I've actually really later on heard a clarification. They actually emailed that person 7 times saying, like your chargeback rate is too high. But it's just this tricky area where anything where you get any chargebacks at all is really off limits for any credit card processing. So people are really afraid of that. And again, so if you open this up to just allowing people for more risky things, like higher amounts, for example, to just use USDC, I think that will be really, really interesting. There might be service that you simply can't get on Uber, Lyft, Bolt that Teleport and the Trip protocol will open up. Like I definitely was in a position where I just wanted to go home, might have, had a drink too much, wanted to get home, but it's Halloween or New Year's and there's just no car available, right?
Yeah.
I think almost anyone who drinks has been there. And even if you don't drink, you might still want to go home, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the great properties of deep-in type projects is that they have the ability to give crypto to users without having to go through the friction of actually onboarding through KYC, going through a centralized exchange. You can just put crypto into people's wallets and they're onto the crypto rails and off they go. I think the total number of people who have ever interacted with on-chain smart contracts is less than, say, 10 million. And I was just having a quick look at Uber customers. It's about 100 million customers around the world. So, I mean, if something like this really takes off, it could be onboarding 100 million people, tenfold sort of what's happened so far on crypto just from one application, which I think is pretty astonishing what the impact of that could be.
So like we have like an internal data science team, and we ran the numbers and we kind of put it on a curve. We have a few interesting ideas and inventions that you're going to see in the light paper for how we're basically structuring this. But we believe it's in the interest of everyone involved in counting on this actually working and taking over the world, as opposed to, like unlocking people too fast. And we don't see this as an investment. We don't see this as anything like that. We see this as this protocol has real true value, and that it replaces something that is really expensive for the drivers and riders. And when we put that on a curve where we're basically saying, this is our expectation where we're going, we're saying 7 years from now, like from the launch date where we turn the key, it's possible for this network to grow at a speed where 50% of global rideshare volume will run on this network. The annual revenue, if this is from memory, so, like if it's wrong, I'll send out a correction, but I think $300 billion have been some predictions per year annual revenue of ride sharing by 2030. And so I don't, like, if we can do this with Uber, right, it's unlikely it stops, right? It's possible that specific countries try to, stop it in one way or another. But then the flip side is, it's not a business, right? If you think about it this way, the local company running this is still a local that can be a local thing. That can be run by a local entrepreneur, meaning this is big enough. Like, we don't want to run a single rideshare company. Like, we just don't. And I think we're a little bit more interested in running one of the clients, because we think there's an opportunity, to keep developing on the client side and add a second protocol like food delivery. So we're more interested in running one of the clients, but we definitely want a strong ecosystem with at least 2, 3, 4 other clients. So literally, we don't necessarily want to operate a single verifier, right? So if you think about it, we basically don't want to operate anything. Maybe we're going to keep operating one of the, I would not even like one of the clients. Hopefully there will be a really strong ecosystem so that if we try to do anything bad with the client, well, one, it's open source. Two, that's what I mean with exit, right? You don't have to trust us. If you don't like it, just fork it. It's kind of like with Chrome. Google can get away with doing a few stupid things, but if it's too stupid, well, there's Edge, there's Opera might even make a comeback if you think about it, right? So
Sure. It's interesting. Like, it's almost doesn't make sense to over-index to this Uber comparison too much, because what you're doing is fundamentally different. You're kind of taking the software that they use to power the network and you're decentralizing that, open sourcing it, and just giving people, whether it's drivers, whether it's the operators of the or of the app that people use, the tools needed to do this coordination, which there's really not that many comparisons I can think of historically that have done this, other than these early examples of the internet with email itself. But certainly could be super powerful primitive. Kind of switching gears here, because we've talked a lot about the vision, about the potential for this to touch a lot of people's lives. Obviously, you had to put a ton of thought into mechanically, how do I make this happen? What technology should I use? You landed on Solana. Talk to us a bit about how you decided to build this on Solana, and maybe what unique properties Solana has that perhaps other blockchains don't.
Yeah, absolutely. So before 2021, I didn't pay any attention to Solana at all. And I was not really curious either, to my own discredit, because I just thought, yet another project. And so many of these projects, I get it. I think VCs just wanted to pour so much money into this whole field, and I was like, so many of them are popping up, but I simply was not interested. I think one of the early indicators that Solana is actually interesting was actually just how much hate it started to get, because people don't actually tend to care about things. Many of these projects are not actually very talked about, even though they have multi-billion-dollar valuations, because there's no real detractors, because the real detractors are like, you don't even need to do anything. If people spend a lot of time criticizing you, it's kind of what happened with Bitcoiners, Bitcoin maxis criticizing Ethereum, Ethereum people now criticizing Solana is kind of in the direction of you wouldn't spend all of like this air, right? You could do other things with your time, like, pools and
Yeah.
margaritas and like just live the good life. But if you're actually wasting this much breath on criticizing Solana, maybe there is something there. It's kind of funny how the Streisand effect sometimes works. So I started looking into it, and it's funny. Like Tolly actually, we didn't overlap, but he was also at Dropbox. So like I got a lot of my engineering mindset. I mean, it was there before, but I got a bunch of it also at Dropbox. But it was very much, like, how do we solve this problem? And it's like, no matter how complicated it is, even if we have to build it all ourselves and we don't use libraries, like we can build anything. It was very much this MIT, like everyone there basically was from MIT. They were just like compilers, programming languages, protocols, whatever it is. Like we can write it in 2 weeks. That was the attitude, and it was very infectious. But it was very engineering focused. They built their own data center. They were just like, we're building everything because we know how to build everything. And I think Solana has a very engineering focused approach as well, where it's just like, I want to create this fast thing. It doesn't need to be what's already out there, right? It doesn't need to be a store of value. It doesn't need to be anything. It's just fast because there's certain applications that we can only do if it's fast and cheap. And I think it's achieved that. And as I found, as a programmer who's been coding for, decades now, I found that things are simple, I understand them. If things are complex, I get confused. And so what's kind of cool about like this monolithic but really fast architecture, even though the programming model is a little bit more complicated on some level, it's still comparatively very easy to reason about. You don't run into like very complicated wrapping this and is the token actually, like IBC has these complicated things on like how you wrap the things, and then they're not really, the same thing because they route none of that, right? It's just flat. It's monolithic. It's easy to reason about. That was a big deal. I think so. It has really high TPS, transactions per second. It's the cheapest transactions. It has, I think, still the highest USDC liquidity among all the chains. Among the fast and cheap chains, at least. Simple architecture with, it's decentralized, and also the community is really, really like it has a builder mindset. So all of this made it very compelling. I heard a lot of people trying to talk me out of building on Solana, and mainly the argument was all the community, all the important people are over on Ethereum and on like the layer 2s over there. And I think that's not a bad argument at all. I'm very, very closely tracking all the layer 2s. And we could, it's like probably less than 1% of our code is on chain because it's very hard to build a ride sharing app with server, with mobile app, with everything. We could probably just rewrite these contracts in a couple of weeks if there was a chain that's fast and it has like, it has all the properties we want. And we are open to that. But since we don't really need crypto liquidity because we're onboarding people using credit cards and allowing people to offboard, like to a bank account, it just never really resonated with me, right? The cheapest, easiest to program for chain with the lowest, the highest transaction volume seems like a really good place to start. I think we're going to have more conversations around this. As I said, it's actually relatively easy to switch for us, but so far, if I just go literally, through the points, except for Ethereum has a more active, bigger community, but it's just direct Ethereum is just too expensive. And then in terms of just transaction volume, Solana is competitive. I don't need total value locked, meaning the things I need to build a consumer app, I all have on Solana. So that's been mainly the argument here.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like almost an elegance you brought up with Solana's architecture, the monolithic nature of it, the composability with other pieces that you might need to use, that where, maybe programming on it is slightly harder than writing Solidity, but as a protocol developer, you don't have to, there's not this massive ramp up learning curve to now let me first learn how IBC works on Cosmos and the order of sending things around and all these edge cases that probably come up that you have not thought of. Solana just kind of, because it's so simple, you can just focus on the actual application and know that you have access to a blockchain that's fast and cheap, and ultimately I think powers a good user experience for customers.
That's exactly right. The other thing is our identity system, which is actually mostly off-chain. if we want to power something like that, we're still using the public keys from the chain that we're on for now. This could be different, but it's kind of like neat because you already have that wallet key, so you can use that to identify yourself. And the other argument I heard a lot, don't you want to be on your own L1? But I'm like, that's not really my expertise. My expertise is,
man.
you know, this. And I think it makes sense on some level if you, again, if the token is really your key focus. But again, our token is not actually, we're not selling our token to anyone. We're not using our token to fund operations. Like the token is just the governance token of the network. We have a company that actually has revenues and the contract is getting revenues. So meaning like just the, we can get fees from the ride sharing companies we operate. We can get fees for providing software as a service, for allowing other people to do this. We have a client that can take a fee, meaning we're operating as a, we don't need to be an L1 because there's a premium for L1, because we don't even want to list the token anywhere. Like, you know, we have no intention of selling it. So like, we're just in this very different position where all of these arguments that you have, why you need to normally build an L1, and that's why you might want to go on like Cosmos or Polkadot, they just don't seem to apply to us. I just want to generate as much revenue as possible on chain, on the protocol, by people actually enjoying getting a ride that's cheaper, faster, better, and fairer to the drivers.
I think as well, you lose that composability. I know you're saying that you know, you don't want to list the token, but obviously on these decentralized exchanges, anyone can list them. So, you know, I think you don't necessarily want to forfeit the possibility of composability in the future, which if you're on your own chain, it just gets a bit trickier. And even L2s, as you say, you can be somewhat siloed for the user experience. It strikes me, we were all around 2017, 2018 when there was the ICO boom. And around then, I just spent, you know, 6-12 months looking at all these papers about how people were going to decentralize Uber, decentralize Airbnb, you know, and there's all this promise. And then it just sort of went away over the next year or two. Everyone decided that was all a scam and, you know, it was never going to work. And now it feels like there's just this resurgence in the last year or two, largely led by chains like Solana, where suddenly those things are possible now. The fees are cheap enough, the chain is quick enough, and we can actually start fulfilling all that promise that got everyone so excited back in 2017. So I'm here for it.
I'm here for it. And I think you're exactly right. Like, I can't afford high fees if I want to compete with, you know, legacy ride sharing companies. And I think the other part is, I think it was probably just not developed enough in a lot of ways. But like, I thought about decentralized Uber for, you know, like years and years and years. Like, you know, I've been in crypto since 2011. And so I've been following like Arcade City, Sword. Like I have like a whole list of like some of the early approaches going back all to like 2011. And many of them actually are very, I think it's almost 2011, might have been 2012. Like, I have a list. I think I'm going to actually put it into the light paper notes, kind of like to kind of outline it. But most of these projects are actually, I think people kind of conflated crypto with peer-to-peer for the longest time. And we're decidedly not peer-to-peer, right? Because just like, by the way, Blue Sky, for example, is another example for non-peer-to-peer protocol. It's actually more like, in the Blue Sky case, if you think about it, it's almost like Twitter had 3 data centers all owned by the Twitter corporation, or now X corporation or whatever. But imagine that if you created a protocol that actually gives that fire hose that makes sure all the data centers are connected, but you make it open so that anyone can run a data center getting all of that data. And you make it easy for people because the data is already there. You can instantly switch server because you have your own public key. No one can impersonate you, but your data is already there because it's on all the servers. You can move around. So I think Blue Sky is probably the closest thing to, and kind of developed in parallel if you think about it, because I think they started thinking about it in 2019, really got started in 2020. So it's kind of like actually on a very similar timeline as us, developing similar ideas. I think they're farthest ahead in someone who does almost the same thing we do in a completely different space. Yeah, Yeah, taking a decentralized approach that is open, but not peer-to-peer.
Right.
And I don't think you can or want to do ride sharing peer-to-peer, right? I mean, you could try, but it's just going to be hard to convince the regulators, that that's a good idea, or even the customers. Honestly, like, it's kind of nice to know someone background checks those drivers, someone has the insurance, and like, if something gets really effed up, exactly, because it's one-to-one the same as the existing system. I think all the past approaches just were a little bit pie in the sky. We don't need any centralized instances, and we're just saying, no, we just want a competitive market, more than one company, and they're all compatible, just like email.
Right. I mean, like, kind of to your point, an agreement there. There's a reason why corporations were invented. Like, we used to barter back in the day. We used to do things peer to peer, probably more so than we do today. But people like someone kind of having oversight, even things like customer service. There's an expectation now, like a minimum level of that, from legacy players all over the stack, that, yeah, I think it makes sense to just decentralize that, but not necessarily rely on just direct interactions with everybody to power these apps.
That's exactly our view. But you also need the blockchain. Give you an example. Let's take a city like Austin, Texas. Let's say there's 3 or there's 5 or there's 6 rideshare companies operating there, all on the trip protocol. And they give you your driver or a passenger, and a match happens. They give you an estimate for how long it takes to drive. Well, they have an incentive to give you a wrong ETA, a wrong estimated time of arrival, because they want to, nudge you to accept the ride, or to go with that specific driver that they match you with, because, the other rideshare company gives you a different offer or a different price. We need to not only enforce that the quality of the ride is good and that everyone is background checked way ahead before the trip can ever be offered. We also need to make sure that these ETA estimates are as accurate as possible. And the algorithms for that are not in the protocol. Like, we don't do on-chain estimation of mapping data, way too complex. That's in the server, but we need to hold them accountable. So how do we do that? Well, on-chain gives us exactly that tool, where you're basically saying, if your ETA estimates are better, then basically you have a better score, which means, there's different ways you can handle this, but you can say maybe the take rate of the contract is lower. The contract takes less of a tariff, if you will, out of that ride, if you have better ETAs and better customer service, and if you just generally have a higher reputation on the network, you do less. Similarly, you can actually add more voting rights. This is not version 1. This will be an upgrade that the community will need to vote on, but we have ideas in the direction of essentially, doing things like staking potentially down the road, where the take rate, again, for certain rideshare companies is lower if more of the drivers stake with that rideshare company. So if the rideshare company, so it's all of this it's this fine adjustment of incentives. And towards that end, we're also going to open source our rideshare simulation, because to make good decisions on how to do governance, we need to open source the tools to simulate these changes to the network. If you just blindly make a change to the network, you could crash the network, and that's not in the interest of anyone. So you need good tools to actually analyze it. So that's kind of the complexity of what we're doing. I think we're doing is crazy ambitious, because not just is the ride-sharing side complex, the regulatory side complex, the crypto side complex, all of it is, but I think we cracked most of it. So the crazy thing is, you're actually going to see us launch this on the order of a couple months.
How many people did it take, by the way? I know I probably should have asked this way earlier, but I know you guys did a seed round, I think late last year, or at least announced it. How big is your team? Are you guys growing, or kind of just holding steady because obviously tons of systems are being built in parallel, it seems, to make this all work.
Exactly. No, everything, right? We looked into some identity solutions, literally every part of the stack, and we had to just do a simpler solution in-house. Again, all of this can be upgraded over time, but we really aimed what's the minimum viable product and what's the minimum viable team. So we're a team of almost 20. I think we're holding steady here. We don't intend to add right now. We have, fantastic people from ex-Cruise Automation, ex-Uber, ex-Coinbase. So like we have, and many, many more. I'm leaving out a ton of people here, but it took a lot, and it's mainly just that it's such a wide range that we're covering. But again, the moment people see this working, like literally with an app they can use, and reading the light paper how it works, I think people will understand why it took so much to pull this off.
What's the rollout plan?
So the rollout plan is we are getting licenses for our own operating companies that, depending on the state, not every operating company is a TNC, but like fully licensed, fully insured with everything in place. And at that point, if you find a driver in your local market and you're in one of the places where we're allowed to operate and they're background checked and everything is in operation, you'll be able to get a ride. And if you're a driver and you sign up, you'll be able to drive. We don't expect volume for quite a while. It will actually be interesting to see this play out because, there's a grapevine of several months where we're going to be a little bit more in the open, where we're going to keep people more in the loop of what's going on than we have so far. So far, we've really been heads down just building. And then as we reach that next milestone where we feel confident in turning on the governance system and confident that we have reached sufficient decentralization that we can say, if we turn off everything that we do, the protocol is still capable of operating even without us. That's where it gets interesting, because in a way, what happens at that point is just like, if you don't believe in it, don't use it. If you believe in it, you can use it and it can work for you if you convince enough other people to also use it. So that's going to be the milestone. We very deliberately, and I think a lot of people are going to tell us we're doing the wrong thing here, very deliberately don't do a classical rollout plan where we are trying to run a rideshare business. We are not. We're not going to bring all the drivers. We're not going to bring all the riders. We're just turning the thing on, and we're creating the tools and incentives for other people to bring the drivers and riders.
Amazing. I mean, we covered a lot of ground here, obviously. So maybe I'll ask kind of a final closeout question. Paul, paint us a picture, maybe 5 or 10 years from now, what this will look like, in society. The decentralized engineering corporation, developer of Teleport. Like, how do you see this kind of panning out?
I think what's going to happen is we're going to show that it's possible to do this to Uber. We're going to, if our focus, and that's going to be really the hard part, if our focus allows us to, we're going to try to do food delivery as well. I think it will really unleash a level of contributions and innovation on this, where people are like, they're going to be saying, your GPS calibration is not good. I'm like, well, it's open source, fix it, right? Like I think people underestimate what's just possible. Like you're seeing this even with like OpenAI, and like there was this Google report that basically said the open source community is running laps around us. The moment these models are open source, same thing is going to happen here. Meaning I don't think anyone will be able to keep up with the open source community improving on all of this. New business models will be possible, because if we can build food delivery on the protocol, other people will build new things, courier services, and so on. Like, just like, I didn't even know what business models are possible if you open this up. And that's the beauty of it. But I think other people will immediately start seeing, we are very clear, by the way, once you read our light paper, it's just very clear in the sense that we don't use any of the complicated words that are so popular in crypto. We barely use the word blockchain. We don't use the word DAO. We don't use, we everything is incredibly simple in how we describe it, because we're aiming for a different market. And I think people will copy that, will immediately get it, copy it, and, they're going to make their own calculations. Is like eBay the thing we should be going after? Is it Indiegogo or Kickstarter? How do we do this? And so 5-10 years from now, I think we're going to be in an interesting situation where whichever chain, I do think there is some, not entirely sure on it, but I think there's some possibility that whichever chain attracts these protocol tokens, and right now Solana is obviously in the lead here very clearly, but I think there will be a race, because people will realize that's the real game here. These protocol tokens will generate massive amounts of revenue that float through the system, meaning they need high transaction volume. Composability is important because, like the identity needs to be compatible with the ride sharing, needs to be compatible with the food delivery. You can't just be off on your own chains to do that and use like complicated wormholes if you're doing something other than trading. So I think the future will be all of these high hundreds of billions of dollars will flow on these protocol tokens, not controlled by any centralized entity. So if you then go further, what actually might happen is that some of these more traditional companies, like who own factories, who are clearly securities because they're actually companies, they might consider, man, there's so much volume, so much better trading tools, so much of a fairer and more liquid market on these chains where there's all these protocol tokens. Maybe we're going to list a securities token on like literally on the chain, and that could be Solana, right? The path here is not to start with financialized instruments. It's actually to start with protocols that are truly decentralized, that can run without any particular company. No one controls it, no one owns it, but they generate revenue. And once you have that, I think the finance and DeFi will follow. Doing it the other way around doesn't work. It's kind of, you're doing DeFi for what? You're just trading tokens for tokens, but there's no revenue.
Incredible. Well, definitely one of the most interesting and potentially game-changing projects I've ever seen in crypto. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sal. Good to see you again. Thank you, Dave. Nice to meet you.